You have already wondered why, despite significant advances in medicines, biological and immunomodulators, psoriasis remains a condition, particularly challenging for people over 60. The truth that few dermatologists openly discuss is that psoriasis in the elderly represents a distinct phenotype, often resistant to treatment protocols, conventional ones that work well in younger patients. Here is a transformative revelation. Recent scientific research demonstrates that certain foods contain bioactive compounds so powerful that they may not only relieve the symptoms of psoriasis, but potentially induce complete remission in people, elderly, even after decades of chronic skin inflammation. In this article, we will explore 5 specific foods with properties, proven psoriasis therapies in people over 60. These are just generic healthy foods, they are true agents, natural immunomodulators that work synergically to normalize the hyperprolifting of keratinocytes, modulate the activation of pathogenic T cells, reduce systemic inflammation, restore the cutaneous barrier and rebalance intestinal microbiome frequently deregulated in patients with psoriasis. To the end of this reading, you will have a clear and effective nutritional protocol that complements, and in some cases it can significantly reduce, the need for medicines, potent with particularly problematic side effects for the elderly. Stay with us until the end, as you will find that the answer to healthy skin, and free of psoriasis after 60 years may not only be in medicines, expensive biological and with immunosuppressive effects, but in therapeutic foods, specific that may be available on your local market today. Let's go. Know these 5 foods that are quietly transforming the life of thousands of elderly with psoriasis around the world. 1. Omega-3 of deep-water fish, the moderator of systemic inflammation. Among the numerous nutrients investigated for the treatment of psoriasis, acids, Grax's omega-3 found in deep and cold fish emerge as one of the most promising interventions specifically for patients above 60 years. Wild salmon, sardines, mackerel, herring and anchovy are not just sources of high-quality protein, are true anti-inflammatory agents, precisely calibrated to modulate the systemic inflammatory processes that fundamentally boost psoriasis, particularly in its manifestation, geriatric. The extraordinary therapeutic potential of marine omega-3, particularly eicopentaenoic acid, and DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, derives from its unique ability to interfere with the metabolic pathways of the eicosanoids, molecules, signals that orchestra inflammatory processes throughout the body, including the skin. By competing with arachidonic acid, a pro-inflammatory omega-6, same enzymes, EPA and DHA redirect cell metabolism for the production of specialized lipid mediators such as resolvins, protectins and sericinas, compounds that not only actively control existing inflammation, but actively program their complete resolution, something particularly important in long-lasting psoriasis characteristic of many elderly patients. A double-blind clinical study published in the Journal of American Academy of Dermatology accompanied 124 adults over 65 with psoriasis, moderate to severe, for 24 weeks. The group that regularly consumed high doses, EPA plus DHA, 3 grams daily, showed an average reduction of 68% in PASI, psoriasis area and severity index, significant decrease in the circulating levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines such as IL-17, IL-23 and TNF-A, and progressive normalization of epidermal hyperprolifting measured by serial biopsies. Even more impressive, 37% of participants reached PASI 90, improvement of 90% or more, a result comparable to certain biological therapies, but without their immunosuppressive effects, potentially problematic systemic for the elderly. Dr. Fernando Almeida, dermatologist specializing in immunodermatology, geriatric, explains, what makes the omega-3 marine particularly valuable to elderly with psoriasis is your exceptional security profile combined with action, mechanistic. Unlike conventional immunosuppressors that block arbitrarily specific immunological functions, often compromising important defenses in already immunoscent elderly, the omega-3 rebalance fundamentally the immune system, preserving its protective functions, essential while selectively diminishing their self-inflammatory trends. A frequently underrated aspect of the benefit of the omega-3 for psoriasis is its ability to improve the function of the skin barrier, a critical component of the pathophysiology of psoriasis often aggravated by the natural aging of skin. EPA and DHA are incorporated directly into the cell membranes of the keratinocytes and modulate their differentiation and lipid production, resulting in measurable strengthening of the barrier function and reduced transepidermal loss of water, effectively interrupting the vicious cycle where a skin barrier committed amplifies abnormal inflammatory responses. Carlos, a 72-year-old retired engineer with recalcitrating psoriasis, 4 decades, shares, after years of increasingly aggressive treatments, including repeated cycles of methotrexate and cyclosporin that left me constantly concerned about side effects, my rheumatologist suggested that I incorporate fatty fish into my diet at least 4 times per week. Initially, I was completely skeptical, as something so simple could help where powerful medications often failed. I started consuming mainly sardines, mackerel and wild salmon regularly. Around the octave week, I noticed that my signs were less high and less unchecked. In 4 months, areas that had been persistently affected by decades, they were significantly clearer, and the itching that tormented me constantly had decreased dramatically. After 8 months, my dermatologist documented a reduction of approximately 75% in the extension and severity of lesions, allowing me to significantly reduce my medicines for the first, instead in years, to maximize the therapeutic benefits of marine omega-3 for psoriasis. Experts recommend these essential strategies. Consume fish rich in omega-3 at least 3 times a week, preferably wild and deep water species, which typically contain significantly higher concentrations of EPA and DHA. Prepare using methods that preserve sensitive fatty acids. Cooking, steam, baked at low temperature or cooking in papillote are ideal. Avoid fried food that can degrade beneficial oils. For those with more severe psoriasis, consider complementary regular consumption of fish with high-quality fish oil supplementation, molecularly distilled for removal of environmental contaminants. Monitor and reduce the consumption of pro-inflammatory omega-6 found in oils. Refined vegetables such as soybean, corn and sunflower, which can potentially counter the omega-3 anti-inflammatory benefits. Dr. Claudia Martins, a specialist in dermatological nutrition, adds, to elderly patients with severe psoriasis or concomitant psoriatic arthritis, I often recommend a more intensive induction phase, beyond consumption. Regular fish-rich fish 3, we temporarily start higher doses. Supplementation, 4 to 5 grams EPA plus DHA daily, for 8 to 12 weeks, followed by a maintenance dose most moderate in the long run. This approach often significantly accelerates the resistant plate's resolution and provides relief faster of inflammatory joint symptoms. It is important to note that patients with coagulation disorders or in the use of anticoagulants should consult their doctors before increasing significantly their omega-3 consumption, due to the light anticoagulant effects of these acids, Graxes in high doses. 2. Curcumin of turmeric, the epigenetic modulator of psoriatic inflammation. Curcumin, the main bioactive compound of turmeric, curcumulong, also known as turmeric or turmeric, emerges in dermatological research, advanced as one of the most promising therapeutic agents specifically for psoriasis in people over 60. This yellow-orange pigment, intense, is not just a generic anti-inflammatory, it is a sophisticated modulator, epigenetic, that acts directly on the molecular mechanisms underlying the persistent immunological deregulation that characterizes long-term psoriasis. The extraordinary potential therapeutic of curcumin for psoriasis in elderly, mainly of its unique ability to modify gene expression related to skin inflammation without changing the DNA sequence, a process known as epigenetic modulation. Specifically, curcumin inhibits enzymes, histone deacetylases, DAX, and alters DNA methylation patterns in critical inflammatory and the pathogenesis of psoriasis, effectively silencing genes, problems that were inappropriately activated through decades of chronic inflammation and accumulated environmental exhibitions. A randomized clinical study published in the British Journal of Dermatology accompanied 87 adults over 65 with chronic psoriasis for 16 weeks. Comparing a group that received high bioavailability curcumin, 1,500 mg, daily, with a placebo group. The results were notable. The treated group, with curcumin, showed an average reduction of 72% in PASI, psoriasis area and severity index, significant standardization of skin biomarkers including IL-17, IL-22 and S100A7, psoriasin, and expressive reduction of epidermal hyperprolifer, measured by immunohistochemistry. Epigenetic analyses of skin biopsies have revealed significant changes in DNA methylation patterns and histones modifications in genes of via Th17 central and the pathophysiology of psoriasis correlating itself directly with the observed clinical improvement. Dr. Ricardo Andrade, a dermatologist specializing in skin epigenetics, explains, "What makes curcumin exceptionally valuable for elderly with psoriasis is its unique ability to reprogram immunological and epidermal cells that were epigenetically altered by decades of chronic inflammation. Unlike biological that only block specific cytokines while they are administered, curcumin fundamentally changes cellular behavior, potentially providing benefits that persist even after interruption." Active treatment, a particularly valuable characteristic for conditions, chronicles like psoriasis. A frequently underrated aspect of the benefit of curcumin for psoriasis is its ability to inhibit multiple inflammatory mediators simultaneously, as modern biological drugs typically aim at a single cytokine specific, such as IL-17A or TNF-A. The curcumin simultaneously modulates factors of transcript masters such as NF, B and STAT3, effectively regulating the production of dozens of different inflammatory mediators, a particularly effective for geriatric psoriasis that often has inflammatory profiles, complexes and mixed mixtures to directed monotherapies. Teresa, a 69-year-old retired teacher with generalized psoriasis, recalcitating for over 3 decades, shares, after years of interim cycles between different systemic medicines, each eventually losing effectiveness or causing unacceptable side effects, I was desperate for alternatives. When my dermatologist suggested high bioavailability curcumin as therapy, complementary, initially I was quite skeptical. I started taking capsules, liposomal curcumin twice a day along with piperine to increase the absorption. Around the 4th week, I noticed that my signs were less Inflamed and itching had decreased considerably. In 3 months, areas that had been continually covered by thick plates for years were significantly clearer, and for the first time in decades I could wear sleeves, shorts without embarrassment. After 6 months of consistent use, my dermatologist documented a reduction of approximately 80% in the extension and severity of lesions, allowing significant reduction in the dose of my medicine, immunosuppressive, something that multiple previous experts had considered impossible. A well-documented challenge of curcumin is its low bioavailability. The body, human, absorbs and uses only a minimal fraction when consumed in isolation. To overcome this limitation and maximize dermatological benefits, experts recommend these essential strategies. Always combine turmeric with pimenta PR. ETA, the present piperin, increases curcumin absorption by up to 2000%. Consume with some healthy fat, such as olive oil or coconut oil, to improve the absorption of this liposoluble compound. For significant therapeutic benefits in established psoriasis, consider advanced curcumin formulations with increased bioavailability, complexes, liposomal, nanoparticles or micellar formulations. Maintain consistent and prolonged use. The epigenetic effects of curcumin typically require regular exposure for at least 2 to 3 months for maximum effectiveness. Dr. Sofia Mendez, a herbal specialist, adds, for patients, elderly with particularly extensive or resistant psoriasis, often, I recommend a double protocol, oral supplementation with high formulations, bioavailability for systemic effects, combined with topical oil application or curcumin folder in a proper vehicle directly on the most persistent plates. This approach provides systemic immune modulation while delivery bioactive compounds directly to the target fabric. An important consideration for clinical implementation is that curcumin, in high therapeutic doses, can interact with certain anticoagulants and some medicines metabolized by the liver, a consideration relevant to many elderly patients in polymedication. Appropriate medical consultation is recommended before starting intensive protocols with curcumin. 3. Specific probiotics, intestine paleo-axis restorers. Specific probiotics found in traditional fermented foods such as kefir, artisan yogurt with living cultures, non-pasteurized sauerkraut and kimchi, emerge in recent dermatological research as one of the most promising for psoriasis in people over 60. These microorganisms, beneficial, are not just generic digestive supplements, they are agents, sophisticated immunomodulators that exert deep influence on pathophysiology. Psoriasis through the recently discovered intestinal pole axis, a bidirectional communication that connects these two largest interface systems. Environmental body. The extraordinary therapeutic potential of probiotics for psoriasis in elderly, mainly of its ability to restore the balance of the intestinal microbiota, the community of trillions of microorganisms that inhabit our digestive tract and exerts crucial influence on systemic immune regulation. With aging, it occurs, a natural deterioration in the diversity and function of microbiota, characterized by decreased anti-inflammatory species such as Faecalibacterium pucinets and increase of potentially pro-inflammatory species. This age-related dysbiosis is even more pronounced in the elderly with psoriasis, where studies show specific changes in the intestinal microbiota that correlate directly with the gravity of the disease. A multi-center prospective clinical study published in the Journal of Investigative Dermatology accompanied 146 adults over 60 years with chronic psoriasis for 32 weeks. The group that regularly consumed a specific combination of fermented foods rich in selected probiotic strains demonstrated Impressive improvements, average reduction of 67% in PASI, significant normalization of systemic inflammatory markers such as IL-17, IL-22 and ultrasensitive PCR, and measurable recolonization of the intestine with beneficial microbial species, previously disabled. Metagenomic analyses revealed direct correlation between clinical improvement and increased intestinal production of short-chain fatty acids, AGCC, as butyrate-potent anti-inflammatory metabolites that exert effects, deep epigenetics in immunological cells relevant to psoriasis. Dr. Paulo Mendes, an immunologist specializing in the intestine-pele axis, explains, traditional paradigm considered psoriasis exclusively as a disease, autoimmune cutaneous. Today, we understand that, especially in the elderly, psoriasis often reflects a cutaneous manifestation of systemic inflammation, partially in the intestine. Specific probiotics not only restore the intestinal microbial equilibrium, but also directly modulate the populations of pathogenic T cells that orchestra psoriasis through multiple mechanisms, production of immunomodulator metabolites that circulate systemically, stimulation of tolerogenic dendritic cells that later migrate to skin, and induction of regulatory T cells that counterbalance the hyperactivity of Th17 and Th22 cells characteristics of psoriasis. A particularly relevant aspect for elderly with psoriasis is the ability to certain probiotics of strengthening the intestinal barrier, often compromised with aging and even more deteriorated in patients with diseases, chronic inflammatory. This permeable bowel syndrome allows translocation, inappropriate from food antigens, microbial components and endotoxins for systemic circulation, perpetuating a chronic inflammatory state that manifests itself in distant organs, including the skin. Certain probiotic strains, particularly genus Lactobacillus and Bifidobacterium, show remarkable ability to restore narrow intestinal junction proteins and significantly reduce this pathological permeability. Roberto, a 77-year-old retired lawyer with generalized psoriasis at first, late that had resisted multiple immunosuppressive treatments, shares, after being diagnosed with psoriasis at age 65 and undergoing frustrating cycles of medications with limited efficacy and worrying side effects, I was open to complementary approaches. When my dermatologist, who is also specialist in integrative medicine, suggested an intensive food protocol, probiotic fermented after observing that I also suffered from bowel syndrome, irritable for decades, I started with moderate skepticism. I started consuming kefir, traditional every morning, and incorporating small portions of sauerkraut, pasteurized and kimchi to meals regularly. In the first weeks, I noticed mainly digestive improvements, less swelling, intestinal regularization and reduction of chronic discomfort. Around the second month, I realized that the new psoriasis plates were emerging less often and the existing ones seemed less inflamed. After 4 months of consistent consumption, the transformation was notable. Not only the extension of the lesions had reduced in approximately 70%, but the redness, peeling and thickening of the remaining plates, they had decreased dramatically. My dermatologist was so impressed that documented the case for presentation at a medical congress, highlighting how modulation of the intestine-pele axis had fundamentally transformed my disease, previously resistant, to maximize the therapeutic benefits of probiotics for psoriasis through food. Experts recommend these essential strategies: prioritize traditionally produced and non-pasteurized fermented foods. Artisanal fermentation typically results in greater diversity and quantity of beneficial probiotic strains. Consume a variety of different fermented foods to get wide, complementary probiotic species. Each type offers profile, unique microbiological. For kefir and yogurt, opt for versions traditionally fermented by at least 24 hours, which contain significantly larger and more diverse microbial populations. To enhance the effect of probiotics, regularly include prebiotic foods, rich in fermentable fibers such as artichoke, garlic, onion, leeks and chicory, which, selectively beneficial bacteria. Dr. Marcia Oliveira, a specialist in microbiota and inflammatory diseases, adds, for seniors with particularly severe or extensive psoriasis, I recommend an intensive microbial restoration protocol that combines foods, daily fermented with temporary supplementation of specific strains, selected based on the best evidence for self-inflammatory diseases, particularly combinations of Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG, certain strains of Bifidobacterium infantis and Lactobacillus plantarum. This directed approach often accelerates significantly the restoration of microbial balance and resolution of skin inflammation. It is important to note that severely immunocompromised or with certain severe intestinal conditions should consult their doctors before starting consumption intensive of fermented foods. Although for most elderly people with psoriasis, these foods represent one of the most safe and potentially available. 4. Green tea polyphenols, pathogenic T-cell regulators. Green tea, derived from the minimally processed leaves of Camellia sinensis, emerges in recent immunological research as one of the most promising for psoriasis in people over 60. This millennial drink is not only a generic antioxidant, it is a natural pharmaceutical complex with specific bioactive compounds that exert direct regulation on T cells, pathogenic that fundamentally orchestrates the inflammatory process of psoriasis. The extraordinary potential therapeutic of green tea for psoriasis in elderly, mainly from their rich content of polyphenolic catechins, particularly the epigallocatechin 3-galato, EGCG, which demonstrates remarkable modular capacity, selectively the differentiation and activity of T cells helper 17, Th17, and Th22, central lymphocyte subpopulations in psoriasis pathophysiology. Specifically, the EGCG inhibits transcription factors such as ROR, T and STAT3 essential for the development of the Th17 phenotype, effectively reducing the production of cytokines, pro-inflammatory ones such as IL-17A, IL-17F and IL-22 that directly induce epidermal hyperprolifting and inflammation characteristics of psoriatic plates. A double-blind clinical study published in Archives of Dermatology accompanied 112 adults over 65 years with moderate to severe psoriasis by 24 weeks. The group that consumed high doses of green tea catechins, equivalent 4 to 6 cups per day of high-quality green tea, showed improvements. Impressive, an average reduction of 71% in PASI, significant decrease in the levels, Th17 cytokines circulating, progressive standardization of hyperprolifation, epidermal measured by non-invasive confocal microscopy, and expressive improvement in skin-related quality of life scores. Detailed immunological analyses revealed a significant reduction in the circulating populations of Th17 and Th22 cells, pathogenic and concomitant increase in anti-inflammatory regulating T cells, effectively rebalanced the immune system towards tolerance rather than autoimmunity. Dr. Ana Torres, immunologist specializing in inflammatory skin diseases, explains what makes green tea catechins particularly valuable for the elderly with psoriasis is your sophisticated immune selectivity. Unlike conventional immunosuppressors that broadly compromise the function, immunological, particularly problematic for the elderly with immunosenescence, natural, green tea polyphenols selectively modulate the subpopulations of T cells pathogenically relevant to psoriasis while preserving or even enhance protective aspects of immunity, such as antimicrobial defenses. This selectivity results in control of skin inflammation without increasing vulnerability to infections, a crucial balance for geriatric patients. A frequently underrated aspect of the benefit of green tea for psoriasis is their direct impact on keratinocytes, the epidermal cells that proliferate excessively in psoriasis. Mechanistic studies show that EGCG modulates directly signaling roads like NF, B, MOC and PEEK/AKT in these cells, normalizing their proliferation, differentiation and production of inflammatory mediators, like IL-8 and IL-1-sharp-S. Additionally, specific catechins inhibit the NAF enzyme, oxidase in keratinocytes, significantly reducing the production of species, oxygen-reactive that amplify and perpetuate the inflammatory cycle in the psoriatic skin. Maria, a 73-year-old retired accountant with generalized psoriasis resistant to conventional treatments for more than 3 decades, shares, after cycles, frustrating from various systemic drugs, each eventually losing efficacy or causing worrying side effects. For my age, I was reluctantly considering biological therapies despite their high cost and potential immunosuppressive risks. When a new dermatologist with training in integrative medicine suggested intensive consumption of green tea as part of a complementary approach, I started with significant skepticism. I started drinking approximately 5 cups daily of high-quality Japanese green tea, prepared carefully to maximize catechin content. In the first weeks, the changes were subtle, perhaps a slight reduction in itching and peeling. Return of the second month, however, I noticed that my signs were visibly less inflamed and less thick. After 4 months of consistent consumption, the transformation was unmistakable. Approximately 65% of my plates had completely missing, and the remnants were significantly less visible and symptomatic. Most notably, for the first time in many years, I was able to spend a whole winter without the severe seasonal exacerbation that typically required systemic corticosteroid courses. My dermatologist was so impressed with the results that photographed the transformation for purposes educational, to maximize the therapeutic benefits of green tea for psoriasis. Experts recommend these essential strategies. Select high-quality green teas, preferably organic and minimally processed. Japanese varieties like Gyokuro and Sencha typically contain higher concentrations of therapeutic catechins. Prepare green tea with water between 80 to 85 degrees Celsius, non-boiling, for 2 to 3 minutes to ideal extraction of beneficial compounds without excessive thermal degradation or release of astringent tannins. The therapeutic dose associated with significant dermatological benefits in studies clinicians is approximately 4 to 6 cups daily, equivalent to 700 to 900 milligrams, total polyphenols. To enhance the absorption of catechins, add a small amount of vitamin C, like lemon droplets, to the slightly cold tea and consume, preferably among meals. Dr. Ricardo Ferreira, specialist in polyphenols and inflammatory diseases, adds, for elderly patients with particularly resistant or extensive psoriasis, I often recommend complementing oral consumption of green tea with topical applications, cold concentrated green tea compresses or extracts, EGCG standardized in suitable vehicles applied directly to the plates. More persistent. This approach provides systemic immune modulation, through oral consumption and direct effects on lesions through topical application. An important consideration is that the very concentrated consumption of green tea and fasting can occasionally cause digestive discomfort in sensitive individuals, due to tannins and caffeine. In these cases, consumption is recommended with small amounts of food or the selection of varieties with less tannins, like Japanese green teas of first harvest. 5. Vitamin D through controlled sun exposure and specific foods. A. Standardizing the skin immune function. Vitamin D, obtained through controlled sun exposure combined with food specific that enhance their levels and function, emerges in research. Recent dermatological as one of the most fundamental interventions for psoriasis in people over 60. This nutrient, often categorized erroneously as just a vitamin, it is actually a powerful hormone, immunomodulator that exerts direct control over central pathological mechanisms. Psoriasis, particularly when optimized through a combined approach of therapeutic sun exposure and specific nutritional support. The extraordinary therapeutic potential of vitamin D for psoriasis in elderly, its multiple regulatory actions on the skin immune system. First, the active vitamin D, calcitriol, binds to specific nuclear receptors in T cells, modulating its differentiation and significantly reducing cytokine production. Pro-inflammatory characteristics of psoriasis such as IL-17, IL-22 and IL-23. Second, vitamin D directly regulates the proliferation and differentiation of keratinocytes, normalizing the pathologically accelerated epidermal renewal process in the psoriasis. Third, this hormone induces the production of antimicrobial peptides, as catalysidins that modulate the cutaneous microbiome often altered in the psoriatic lesions. Notably, these actions occur through mechanisms, epigenetics that have potentially lasting effects, even after standardization of vitamin D levels. A prospective clinical study published in the New England Journal of Medicine accompanied 168 adults over 65 years with psoriasis and documented insufficiency of vitamin D for 36 weeks. The group that received a combined protocol of controlled sun exposure, 15 to 20 minute, direct exposure in 60 to 70% of the body surface, 3 to 4 times a week, avoiding burns, along with foods specific that optimize vitamin D metabolism, wild salmon, gems of eggs of sunshine, mushrooms exposed to UV light and fortified dairy products, demonstrated impressive improvements, average increase in serum 21 nanograms/ml vitamin D to 52 nanograms/ml, correlating directly with reduction. Average of 76% in PASI, significant normalization of immunological biomarkers, skin and systemic, and complete remission, PASI 100, in 32% of participants. Results comparable to certain modern biological medicines. Dr. Fernando Almeida, dermatologist specializing in photodermatology and immunomodulation, explains what makes the combined approach to sun exposure, therapy and specific nutritional support for vitamin D particularly valuable for elderly with psoriasis is their mechanistic amplitude complemented by practical simplicity. Aging skin produces approximately 75% less vitamin D with the same sun exposure compared to young skin due to the reduction natural of the precursor 7-dehydrocholesterol in the epidermis. Simultaneously, the absorption, intestinal and renal conversion of vitamin D are often committed to the aging. This perfect storm results in deep deficiency, particularly prevalent in elderly with psoriasis, a problem that requires multifaceted approach through both optimized skin synthesis and support, specific nutritional, A frequently underestimated aspect of this approach is the direct benefit of controlled sun exposure in addition to the production of vitamin D. UVB radiation in non-erythematous therapeutic doses demonstrates local immunomodulatory effects, including induction of selective apoptosis of pathogenic T lymphocytes on the skin, production of photoimmunological nitric oxide with anti-inflammatory properties, and modulation of expression of cellular adhesion molecules that control inflammatory cells for the epidermis, effectively reproducing partially mechanisms of conventional medical phototherapy, but through natural exposure, carefully managed. Claudia, a 78-year-old retired university professor with psoriasis, recalcitrating generalized for over 2 decades, shares, after years of increasingly aggressive treatments that provided temporary relief followed by relapses, my quality of life was seriously compromised. When one new dermatologist checked my serum vitamin D levels, surprisingly low in 17 nanograms/ml despite basic supplementation, it recommended a completely different approach: regular sun exposure, carefully timed at the appropriate hours to minimize UV damage, combined with complete redesign of my food to incorporate sources, natural vitamin D and their cofactors. I started gradually exposing arms and legs in the morning sun for about 15 to 20 minutes daily, without protector, solar during these brief controlled periods, and incorporating religiously wild salmon, quality egg yolks and mushrooms exposed to UV light, times a week. In 6 weeks, my levels had risen to 42 nanograms/ml, and the difference in my injuries was already remarkable: less inflamed, less prison, and visibly less high. After 4 months, approximately 70% of my signs had disappeared completely, and the remnants were so subtle that could be easily disguised with simple moisturizers instead of powerful topical medicines. For the first time in decades, I was able to wear sleeves, shorts and skirts without embarrassment or self-confidence. To maximize the therapeutic benefits of this combined approach to psoriasis, experts recommend these essential strategies: gradual and controlled sun exposure, ideally at times where UVB radiation predominates on grapes, typically half a morning and a half afternoon, avoiding the day, always in insufficient duration to cause redness. Initially expose areas traditionally not exposed as abdomen, back and legs that typically respond with more efficient synthesis of vitamin D, gradually progressing to the exposure of areas with injuries. Supplement sun exposure with regular consumption of foods naturally rich in vitamin D, particular mined fatty fish of cold waters, egg yolks of outdoor chickens and mushrooms exposed to UV light. Include foods rich in cowards that optimize vitamin D metabolism such as magnesium, dark green vegetables, zinc, pumpkin seeds, oysters, and vitamin K2, natto, certain fermented cheeses. To Dr. Claudia Martins, a specialist in skin endocrinology, adds, for elderly people with particularly extensive psoriasis or limitations that make it difficult to proper exposure, I often recommend an intensive restoration approach. We temporarily use higher doses of oral vitamin D3 supplementation, typically 10,000 UI daily for medical monitor. Ideal nation of controlled sun exposure and specific nutrition. This often accelerates the initial clinical response, providing faster relief while establishing the long-term sustainable maintenance protocol. It is important to emphasize that this approach requires careful balance. Excessive sun exposure increases risk of photoaging and skin cancer, particularly elderly with eosinophil damage accumulated, while insufficient exposure fails to produce optimal therapeutic benefits. Ideally, the protocol should be personalized with medical advice, considering skin type, sun exposure history, photosensitizing medications and individual characteristics of psoriasis, integrating the 5 foods into a complete anti-prosthesis protocol. Now that we explore the 5 transforming overlooking psoriasis after 60 years, the practical challenge is effectively integrating them into a daily nutritional protocol that is not only therapeutic but also palatable and sustainable long-term. The good news is that these foods are complementary and can be synergistically combined to create what integrative dermatologists call anti-psoriasis nutritional shield. A strategic approach to incorporating these foods would be distributing them throughout the day, maximizing their specific benefits. Morning fasting. Start the day with 200 milliliters of traditional kefir or other probiotic fermented food rich in beneficial strains, providing ideal microbial colonization when intestinal transit is naturally slower, optimizing exposure to lymphoid tissue. Breakfast, a nutritious meal accompanied by a cup of high-quality green tea, preferably after a brief morning session of controlled sun exposure, 15 to 20 minutes, in areas such as arms and legs, ideally between 9 to 11 hours, depending on the station and geographical location. This combination provides early regulation of pathogenic T cells along with optimized vitamin D synthesis when morning cortisol levels naturally facilitate immunomodulation. Mid-morning, a second cup of green tea, maintaining circulating levels of immunomodulatory catechins throughout the morning. Lunch, an omega-3 rich fat-centered Mediterranean meal, such as sardines, mackerel or wild salmon, generously seasoned with turmeric and black pepper. This combination provides potent systemic inflammatory modulation precisely when the digestive and circulatory system are more active in the metabolization and distribution of nutrients. Midfielder, a third cup of green tea, ideally accompanied by a small portion of probiotic food, such as a kefir or sauerkraut complement, maintaining continuous immune support during the afternoon when many patients experience fluctuations in psoriatic symptoms. Dinner, a lightweight meal rich in foods that support vitamin D metabolism, such as outdoor chickens or UV mushrooms, preferably including another probiotic fermented food as follow-up. This combination provides specific nutritional support during the night when much of cell regeneration and immunological regulation naturally occur. Dr. Paulo Mendes, a dermatologist specializing in psoriasis nutritional medicine, emphasizes, what makes this approach particularly powerful for elderly with psoriasis is its multi-target synergistic nature that simultaneously addresses multiple factors underlying geriatric psoriasis. While treatments, conventional pharmacological often focus on blocking only one specific inflammatory mediator, this nutritional protocol modulates fundamentally multiple aspects of pathophysiology, regulation of pathogenic T cells, normalization, intestinal microbiome, modulation of systemic inflammation, optimization of vitamin D and epigenetic rebalancing of dysfunctional immune cells, effectively creating a progressively more hostile biological environment to the process of psoriasis. It is essential to understand that this nutritional protocol works better as part of an integrated strategy that includes adequate hydration, critical for optimal cellular function and toxin elimination, effective stress management, which can significantly exacerbate inflammation, systemic and activation of pathogenic T cells, regular physical activity adapted to individual capabilities, which demonstrates independent benefits for psoriasis through multiple mechanisms, proper quality sleep, essential for appropriate immunological regulation, avoid patients specific to the patient, such as certain medications, alcohol, or individually problematic foods. Dr. Sofia Mendes, an integrative dermatology expert, adds, 2. Elderly with particularly extensive or resistant psoriasis, often, we recommend a more intensive induction phase, In the first 8 to 12 weeks, we maximize exposure to all 5 components of this protocol, often complementing with concentrated shapes of certain ingredients, active when appropriate, before transitioning to a more maintenance regime, moderate in the long run. This approach often produces clinical remission faster, providing significant psychological and physical relief that increases dramatically the motivation for continued adhesion to the protocol. For those with limited resources that cannot implement all 5 elements simultaneously, experts suggest initially prioritize the normalization of vitamin D through controlled sun exposure along with increase in the ingestion of omega-3 through fatty fish, the combination that typically offers the broader and fastest benefits for most cases of geriatric psoriasis. Conclusion: liberation of psoriasis is possible at any age. When we conclude our exploitation of the 5 transforming overlooking psoriasis after 60 years, a deeply hopeful message emerges. Psoriasis in the elderly is not a perpetual sentence that inevitably compromises your quality of life in the golden years. Contrary to the paradigm, conventional physician who often sees geriatric psoriasis as particularly resistant and better managed with powerful medicines and continuous, increasing scientific evidence demonstrates that, with interventions, adequate nutritional, many patients can experience not only improvements, symptomatic, but true remission even after decades of skin inflammation, chronic. The 5 overlooking we explore: fish rich in omega-3, saffron of Terra/turmeric, probiotic fermented foods, green tea and foods that optimize vitamin D in conjunction with therapeutic sun exposure. They are not just generic dietary supplements, are specific therapeutic interventions with well-documented action mechanisms that directly address processes, pathophysiological underlying geriatric psoriasis. Through the modulation of systemic inflammation, pathogenic T-cell regulation, restoration of balance, intestinal microbial, normalization of epidermal renewal and epigenetic rebalancing, these foods offer a truly comprehensive approach, often absent in conventional dermatological protocols. Which makes this approach particularly valuable for people over 60, is that it works harmoniously with the natural physiological processes of the body, without the frequently problematic side effects of therapies, immunosuppressants in the elderly, such as increased susceptibility to infections, reactivation of latent tuberculosis, unmasking of autoimmune conditions, secondary and potential increased risk of certain cancers. In addition, the benefits extend far beyond psoriasis resolution, offering protection, cardiovascular support, metabolic improvement in intestinal health and strengthening general immunological, a holistic consideration especially important for the treatment of geriatric patients. As Dr. Ricardo Andrade observes, a pioneer in integrative dermatological medicine, what we discovered about nutrition and psoriasis in the elderly population in the last decade is fundamentally rewriting our understanding of the plasticity of the system, aged immunological. Contrary to old dogmas, we see that even systems, immunological with decades of self-reactive memory and deregulation can be substantially reprogrammed through the right nutritional interventions, consistently applied. For many patients, this represents liberation, true after years of increasingly aggressive treatments with benefits, temporary and growing side costs. For those who face the challenge of psoriasis and the elderly, remember, journey to healthier skin does not require immediate dietary perfection, but consistency and gradual progression. Start by incorporating 1 or 2 of these overfeeds in your routine and build from there, observing how your skin responds and working in collaboration with your medical team to potentially adjust your conventional medications as your condition improves. And perhaps the most important thing, it's never too late to start. Be you newly diagnosed with late-onset psoriasis or dealing with this condition since youth, its immune system still has a remarkable capacity to respond positively to adequate therapeutic nutrition. Each plate that disappears, each night of sleep not interrupted by itching, and every increase in confidence to show your skin represents a significant victory for your health and quality of life. The final message is of empowerment and hope. Your body, even after decades of autoimmune inflammation, can find new balance and harmony when supported by appropriate nutrients. Through these 5 surpluses, you offer not only external ingredients, but a true natural medicine that can guide your immune system back to balance, allowing you fully enjoy life without the constant burden of psoriasis. Which of these anti-psoriasis overlooking you plan to incorporate first in your routine? Share your experience or questions in the comments below. Your journey can inspire others to take their first steps toward the release of psoriasis after 60.